Hey, this is Zircon, and I've been talking about this giant beast behind me, and now it's finally time to take a closer look. Here's a quick preview of what's to come in this video. Now, if you've ever heard me talk about music production and synthesis, you probably know that I use a lot of software synths. Things like Zebra 2, and then more recently, Serum, Vital, Phase Plant, plus of course samplers like Contact. But all of those are totally different than this thing behind me, which is called a modular synthesizer. Now, if you already know what a modular is, don't worry, I'm not going to go into a super deep explanation in this video. And I actually want to show both the kinds of sounds that I'm making with it and then how I'm using it in my music going forward. But for those of you who are looking at this with a sense of both awe and confusion, let me give you the quick breakdown. In a traditional synthesizer, each component or each element of the synth is connected. Sounds logical, and it is. For example, the oscillator, which generates the tone, goes through something like a filter, and then it might be modulated by a low frequency oscillator or LFO. It might go through some effects like a reverb, delay, distortion, and then it goes out into either your DAW, or in the case of a hardware synthesizer, it goes out through some output jacks. Now, of course, there are some more complex synthesizers that allow you to do different kinds of routing. For example, the ASM Hydrasynth, which I used to own, has some different options for the flow of the sound. But by and large, most synthesizers, at least most of the ones that most people use, have a generally fixed routing from start to finish. Then there are semi-modular synthesizers. These have a mostly fixed structure, but you have the ability to create your own connections using patch cables. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Elta Music Solar 42. And this is what got me into modular synthesis to begin with. I'll put a graphic up on screen, but basically this has some predetermined routing. It has oscillators, it has envelopes that affect the oscillators, it has a filter, it has effects, and all of those things are already pre-connected. However, it also has these so-called patch points where you can have voltage going in and out to control different parts of the synth. You can route the LFO into the oscillator or into the filter and do all kinds of other interesting routing. But really the power of a semi-modular is that those patch points go beyond just LFO and filter cutoff, but they encompass a whole bunch of interesting and unique routings. And you don't have to use just a control voltage signal. That would be something like an LFO. In many cases, you can actually use an audio signal. The bottom line is that a semi-modular gives you more flexibility than a typical fixed architecture synth, but it's also a lot easier to use than this kind of thing, which is a fully modular synthesizer. This is actually how the whole world of analog synthesis started. If you look at these historical pictures, they pretty much all look like this. There are a whole lot of different kinds of modular synthesizers before we even get into the modules themselves, but this kind is the most popular, and it's called Eurorack. The format determines the kind of power that the modules take, the height and size, and then how the patch cables are designed. They use 1/8" cables as opposed to 1/4", which you would use for, guitars or other instruments. A modular synth is like building your own synthesizer with Legos, with each Lego brick being a different module. If you want to have an oscillator, you have to get an oscillator module. If you want to swap out your oscillator, you would either add another one or just physically swap them out. There are tons of different kinds of oscillators, filters, envelope generators, also known as function generators, lots of different kinds of effects, and lots of really complex but really interesting other ways to transform and shape the signals. It is virtually limitless in the creative possibilities, provided you have the space, the power, and the budget to support it, but it comes with two major downsides, even if you have all the money and power and space in the world. The first is that all of those modules have to be manually connected. That means there is absolutely no functionality at all until you start using those patch cables to connect things. This is something that took me by surprise when I first started exploring this world. If you take an oscillator and you connect it to one of the output jacks, you're just going to hear a constant tone. There's no pitch control, there's no volume control, nothing. It's just a constant tone, almost like you turned on a faucet and the water is just flowing straight down. In order to do anything, whether you want to use envelopes to make like a staccato sound or a pad, if you want to have some kind of sequence going in or some way to actually control the pitch, you have to manually connect or patch all of that, which means that making any kind of sound with a modular synth takes time, and you have to be very deliberate when you're doing it, because there's a second downside. There are no presets. Most hardware synths, and pretty much all soft synths, have the ability to switch back and forth between pre-made sounds. That's not the case with a modular synth. You have to commit to this idea that what you're doing is just in the moment. You can't flick between presets. You can't save it and load it, come back to it later. What you produce and what you record, that's it. And even though I originally said that it's a downside, I actually find it really creatively inspiring to be forced into that kind of workflow. After all, at this point, I probably have many dozens of software synthesizer plugins, tens of thousands of presets. I mean, I could spend all day just switching through presets. And sometimes that is inspiring, but other times it's so overwhelming to have that much choice that it can actually take away from inspiration, something that they call analysis paralysis. So if you're dealing with something that doesn't have presets, that entire analysis paralysis goes out the window, and it lends itself to a very improvisational way of creating sounds. Now, just to be clear, I did not start with this whole thing behind me. I didn't buy it in all one big piece in a week, in a month. This came together over the course of pretty much a whole year, 2024. I started with a much smaller system using the IntelliGel palette case, and then I sort of graduated to bigger and bigger cases until I got to this one, which is a custom cabinet created by Modular. And along the way, I tried a lot of different modules, some of which I kept and some of which I traded or sold. If this is something you ever want to dip your toes into, don't be intimidated. You always start small. Now that you have a general idea of what a modular synth is, we're going to take a closer look at how we can change the sound in real time by moving some cables around and tweaking some knobs. We're going to take a little journey through this patch, starting with the heart of it, which is the Synths Black sequencer. This is what's sending the tempo to many of the other modules, as well as the rhythms to some of them, and the pitches to some of them as well. But it's not the only way to influence a live performance. This IntelliGel tetrapad is connected to a physical modeling module, and it's sending both pitch and gate information that allows me to play and hold notes. Let's check out the kick. This is the Mandrake by Maelstrom. It's as analog as it gets. Right next to it, Pixie. This is a multimodal module, has a whole bunch of different synthesis types. Here I'm using it for the snare, which is sort of 808 style. But what's generating these rhythms? In this case, it's a module called Grids, which generates pseudo-random sequences for kick, snare, and hi-hat. And those are the three instruments I have connected to it for rhythms. Here's one of my favorite modules. You've been hearing it this whole time. The drums are going into Data Bender by Qubit. Sort of like Stutter Edit and D-Blue Glitch in hardware format. I can't get enough of it, honestly. One of my main reverbs here is Starlab by Strymon, and right next to it is Qubit Nautilus for delay. Very powerful, very inspiring, and I love the shimmer of it. But I also have one of the very best reverb pedals, the Meris Mercury X. There's a saw synth going into this here and back into the modular setup. Oh yeah, and tuning, that's something that you have to do manually. Even if you send a pitch signal, every oscillator has its own coarse and fine tuning. I have to tune up this dual oscillator here, which is set to a sine wave. But how do we determine the notes? Here's IntelliGel scales. Whenever I send a rhythmic trigger, it picks a random note from the scale, and I can select which notes are part of that scale. This is a great way to get generative style arpeggios, just endless sequences. I'm sending a split of the Mandrake kick into this pedal chain, which includes an EQ, a distortion, and a chorus, which is currently bypassed. Very crunchy. A little bit more tweaking of the Nautilus. I don't fully understand what this module is really capable of. All I can tell you is that it's very inspiring and a whole lot of fun to play with. Doesn't hurt that it's beautiful to look at too. Looking at the black sequencer again, let's change the pattern of the sine wave arpeggio. I love the hands-on aspect of this module. And now we can shape that sine wave oscillator into a saw. I haven't talked a lot about the patch points in the modulation I'm using, but here's an example of setting up a new one. The output from oscillator 2 into the FM input of oscillator 1. Remember what I said about tuning by ear? Definitely relevant when you're doing FM. It's a little bit more art than science. Here's that physical modeling module I was talking about before. I know this is something that definitely exists in the software world, but something about actually adjusting the knobs by hand, having all the parameters in front of me, I just find it way more inspiring. Especially as I'm playing it with my right hand on the tetrapad. Let's check it out. It's got 8 touch-sensitive pads. And the functions can be assigned and reassigned to a whole bunch of different things, but here I'm using it for simple note on and off, and then I've assigned a scale so that when I press each pad, I get a new note. Here's the other bass drum I'm using from Mosaic Audio. This is the 4 on the floor kick that you're hearing. You can actually see the trigger coming through on that transparent cable. The super saw style oscillator that's going into that Maris reverb is also running through this filter. And a couple modules to the left, the Steady State Gate by Steady State Fate. This is my absolute favorite filter. It's also an envelope, something that's known as a low-pass gate. I'm sending the bass pattern through it now. All right, this was just an example, but let's go into the DAW and take a look at some other performances and how I'm actually using them for song production. Okay, so in FL, what I've done is I've pulled in a bunch of these improvisations. They're kind of like performances, but this is the entire thing. They're not edited at all. If I just grab one of these here, Just got some random noise and effects coming through. I think I'd routed some stuff through a filter at max resonance. I want to say it was the Volt Freak. That was just 2 minutes in. This goes on for 25 minutes. Let's jump around way more rather than seeing these small changes, just how it evolves. How about this improv here? I'll say this, I don't plan any patch in advance. It is totally spur of the moment. I'm not using any kind of diagrams or anything like that. But for this particular session, I remember I wanted to try out a type of a module called a sequential switch. The way it works is you can have it in one of two modes. In one mode, which is what I'm using it for here, you can send up to 4 audio sources in, and then one source goes out, but they don't all get mixed together. It actually steps between them, and you can send any kind of trigger source. It could be a manual source, it could be from a sequencer or anything else. And I wanted to experiment with that concept throughout this session. So at the very beginning, it's just some raw oscillators. They're not being shaped or anything, just going back and forth. So let's skip ahead. Okay, this is already sounding pretty usable. And as it goes on, I'm just building the patch up and up and up. Generally with these sessions, I'm not ever going to tear everything out and start from scratch. I have some kind of workflow, some kind of general routing, and I want to build on that so I don't have to spend the time connecting everything again. At this point, now we have, I think, 3 sources hooked up, and then later on it'll be 4. There we go. I remember there thinking, okay, this is sounding good. What I did was I aligned it to the grid, and then I thought, let me just throw a 4 on the floor kick and see what happens. That sounds pretty good. Like I'm liking that bass sound, and I just threw on some maximizing things, Sound Goodizer, OTT. Let's hear how that sounds. And how about some EQ? Okay, so you can hear where my mind is going. Like I'm listening to these long sessions, which are very improvisational, and then I'm finding the little bits that I could either build a track around or I could add to a section to thicken it up, see if there's anything complementary. Here's a totally different improv session. This started off with the same setup as the last one, but then it changes quite a bit. Way more droney at this point. Let's move it down a track here, and you can see this one was pretty long actually. Wow, how long was this? This was like at least half an hour, I think. We'll turn off the kick for now. That's that Nautilus delay. Some fun, I think this is like wave shaping happening. And then check out what happens towards the end. I remember this. There's a filter, the resonance is going way, way, way up. It's just a filter that is being driven like crazy, and I figured, let me just let that ride at the end. Maybe I could resample that. And then here's another improv. Started with 16ths, pretty simple. Turned into these extended drones. Very crunchy. And it just gets like super broken up later on. I think this was running it through Data Bender again. You get the general idea of this approach. Now I'm going to show with about 20 minutes of work what I was able to do, just adding some simple, very, very simple drum patterns and then layering 4 or 5 of these performances together. I'll start with just one at a time. You heard this one already. I think it's a great start to the bass. And then I added in this here. Just another kind of rhythmic pulse. Then there was a moment in this track here. It was like a white noise distortion kind of thing. Got to sidechain it, of course. Ooh, love it. This is a different part of this 1402 performance, and this is like a super driven filter. I think it's the Volt Freak. But you want to hear it all together, so let's check that out. Now we're talking. Now we're talking. This is good. This is good. How about one more layer? Low bass drone. I guess you'd call this like just techno, straight up techno, right? How about adding in some hats? How about a snare too? Very, very simple, like I said. But just the natural evolution of these performances, layering them and beat syncing them. One of the downsides of modular synthesizers, though, is that it's a little laborious to try to program the exact sequence of notes you want, especially chords or chord progressions. It can be done, but it is definitely fiddly. It is much, much quicker, like an order of magnitude faster to just write the exact notes you want in a piano roll. Now, while I could send this out to the modular through MIDI out, I just wanted to see how a simple melodic sequence would sound with this patch Killer Super Saw that I made. This is actually based on an AU5 patch, so shout out to him. Guess that doesn't do anything. I don't know about you, but I absolutely love the way that's sounding, and it is most definitely going to make it into a track, if not become a whole track with other elements and writing. You can see that this is a very, very different approach than how I've worked before, if you've seen any of my tutorials. I don't know, I think this whole approach really gelled with me, because when I was using hardware synths like the Roland V synth, for example, and the ASM Hydra synth, some other pretty awesome synthesizers, honestly, the way I integrated them was like I was using a plugin. So I'd write all the MIDI, I'd send it out, but it was less convenient than using a plugin soft synth. You only get a handful of voices and you can't render it offline. You have to wait for it to record. And I think it felt simultaneously too limited, but also not limited enough. Like in some ways, for example, the total lack of presets and preset recall is a lot more limiting in the modular world. So I really had to take that big step into a totally different workflow. Like I'm not looking at a screen like my phone, a computer, laptop, whatever, when I'm doing synthesis on the modular. I'm able to just get in this state of flow and just vibe to the music, which is something I've never been able to do with hardware before. And that's why I like it. So let me know your thoughts. Is this crazy? Is this inspiring? Do you have some kind of hardware synthesis setup? Let me know how you use it. Leave a comment below. All right, this has been Zircon. I'll see you in the next one.